Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you so much for being here today for the wine ecosystem. What is old is new again. My name is Jacky Blisson. I am a master of wine, and I am also the director of mentorship here at FdV. This is going to be a 90-minute session, 60 minutes of discussion, followed by 30 minutes Q&A. So feel free at any time to put your questions into the Q&A box. They will be gathered together by our wonderful team, and then we'll address those in those last 30 minutes. And also feel free to carry on the conversation offline on social media at Femme du Vin, at AdVini.Quebec. AdVini are a wonderful sponsor today. Hashtag FdV Spring 2021, hashtag AdVini. Thank you everybody so much for being with us here today. And thank you so much for your donations. We are so grateful for your support. Our scholarship fund is a really huge part of our platform here at Femme du Vin. And it's really meaningful for the women who receive them, who are starting out or trying to get ahead with their wine education and their career goals. We'd also obviously like to thank our sponsor today. If you don't know AdVini, they're one of the leading French wine groups with over 2,000 hectares of vineyards, some 30 estates and wineries throughout France and South Africa, and a leader in sustainable wine initiatives in France. Finally, I'd like to introduce and to thank today's panelists. Carmen Etcheverry is the Sustainable Development Manager in AdVini. She grew up in the vineyards of the Roussillon, studied agronomy and enology in Toulouse, joined AdVini in the role of Sustainable Development Manager in 2019. Thank you, Carmen. Ellen Jakobsmeier is a sommelier and the export director for Genuine Wines. She was born in Toronto, worked for a long time as a sommelier, has done harvests in the McLaren Vale in Marlborough. She did a wine commerce degree in Dijon and has been based in Sancerre since 2017 at Genuine Wines. Thank you for joining us, Ellen. Finally, we have Michel Bouffard, sommelier, WSET professor, MW candidate, author, and the founder of Tasting Climate Change. Warm welcome to you, Michel. And unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Etinosa Emokpai, a highly experienced Philadelphia-based sommelier and wine sales associate with Skurnik, is unfortunately unable to join us. She had a last-minute emergency, so she will not be with us today, but you are in good hands because our three other panelists are experts in their fields, and this promises to be a great discussion. I'm going to give you a little bit of preamble, and I'm also going to give you a little overview of the different sustainability, organic, biodynamic labels and certifications that exist in France, and then we're going to dive in with Carmen. So really major strides have been made all over the world in terms of wine sustainability, in terms of reducing harmful chemicals, increasing biodiversity, reducing waste, increasing energy efficiencies, raising social consciousness, basically to produce, to ship, to sell, to consume wine in a more holistic and sustainable manner. France, as you know, is one of the top 3 largest wine producing countries, and it's also one of the most historic. They've been making wine there since classical antiquity. Sustainable methods that are becoming the norm today in France are really something, if you think about it, there's something of a return to pre-industrial and pre-agrochemical times. So when you think about today's theme, what is old is new again, it's really this idea of returning to these ancestral methods, but marrying them with these modern innovations that really driving sustainability forward. If you think about it, not so long ago, really only about 10 years back, France had somewhat of a murky history when we're talking about the environmental aspect of sustainability. Figures vary, but in around 2013, we're talking about France being one of the highest users of agricultural pesticides in Europe. One of the figures I saw was about 3% of France's agricultural land is dedicated to vineyards, but they were responsible for spreading over 20% of the country's fungicides. So not a great track record. However, the improvement that's been seen in these last 10, 15 years has been nothing short of spectacular. global wine and spirits analyst company IWSR, in their 2021 report, has shown that consumption of organic wines in the country has doubled since 2013. And by 2023, they're set to be the world's largest consumer of organic wines. And also the production has increased significantly from around 165 million bottles in 2013 to a forecasted 613 million bottles in 2023. And this is obviously what is certified. There's so many excellent producers out there who are practicing sustainable, organic, or even biodynamic methods that aren't certified. So obviously, these are just the numbers that we have recorded. When we're talking about the different sustainability certifications, there's quite a few, and navigating through them can be a bit complicated. So I'm just going to touch on some of the major ones that my panelists will be discussing later on to just give you a sort of a brief overview and situate you. When we're talking about sustainability, one of the earliest sort of formalizations of the concept was terra vitis. And this is really a form of lutte raisonnée, or reasoned agriculture, something that many vignerons in many different regions were already practicing. This terra vitis came about in the late 1990s. And the idea of reasoned agriculture is really just to use chemicals only when absolutely necessary, to limit the amount of treatments in the vineyards to the bare minimum. And what was interesting about terra vitis is they had a really tailored approach. It was managed by 6 different regions, and they had varying specifications depending on the region, and that they update their guidelines every year to make sure that they really are moving with the times and evolving. A more recent and potentially more holistic move towards sustainability is obviously the Haute Valeur Environnementale, HVE, High Environmental Value Certification. And this was developed by the French Ministry of Agriculture in 2001. It's a 3-tier certification system, with the 3rd tier obviously being the highest tier. And its major focus areas are increasing biodiversity, decreasing chemical use, especially pesticides and fungicides, managing fertilizer inputs, and improving water management. The French goal is to have a minimum of 50% of all growers in estates and wineries certified by 2025. And they've got really strong industry support. Terra vitis and HVE are starting to really align so that wineries with terra vitis can transition over to HVE, the 3rd level. So that's quite interesting how they're coming together. If we're looking more specifically at organics, obviously the difference being that in organic viticulture, we prohibit entirely the use of synthetic chemical products and GMOs. So in terms of organics, there are 2 major labels used. One is Conversion à Agriculture Biologique, CAB. And this is the label that is used during the conversion process. As you know, the conversion to organic certification is a 3-year process. And this CAB label actually brings recognition and visibility to producers while they're in this transition period. They have to be following the rules of organic production during this period, and they can use this CAB label for the 2nd and the 3rd year of this process. So Agriculture Biologique, AB, is the major organic label used in France. And as I said, no synthetic chemicals, no GMOs. It also strictly limits and controls the types of products that can be used in the winery. Much lower sulfur limits, for example, no de-alcoholizing, no electrodialysis. There's quite strict controls on what can be done in the winery. There are regular external audits, as with HVE, and it's aligned with the European organic standards. So quite a robust program, and certified, one of the major certifying bodies for AB is EcoCert. If you move into biodynamics, the major labels used in France are Demeter and Biodivin. Wines must first be certified organic, and the process for keeping up your certification is fairly similar to HVE and to organic. There are regular external audits, and there's the concept of continual improvement, that you're constantly looking to enhance your practices and improve. The biodynamics feeds on similar notions to organics, but really sort of goes a step beyond. It follows the principles of Rudolf Steiner, as you know, and it really views the vineyard as a self-contained ecosystem. And the idea is to strengthen vines so that they're better able to resist disease on their own, working with and within nature's rhythms. So with that sort of quick, brief overview of all of the different labels and certifications, there are others, obviously, but these are the major ones that exist out there. I'm going to move on to our first panelist today. We're going to start with Carmen, because I just think it's so telling that AdVini has an entire, not only a sustainable development manager, but an entire team dedicated to sustainable development, which is really quite a new thing. So Carmen, what does this mean in practice?
Thank you for this synthesis. The exercise wasn't simple, but well, it's a vast array, actually. Our mission is to accompany all the profession of our company toward to an even more sustainable development. Mm-hmm. So in concrete terms, that means that we have to train, to support innovative projects, and to push and challenge all our technical director and winemaker towards a holistic approach of our vineyards. Just a few words about AdVini. As a French leader in terroir wine, we create synergy between the entire wine sector. We are long-established wine grower, vineyard owner, and specialist of wine at all stages. And under the AdVini banner, our vineyards and winery deploy all the know-how of the winemaking and the finest terroir in France, but also in South Africa. Mm-hmm. Our vineyard cover around 2,000 hectares with 20 domains, chateaux, and winery. So we all share the same philosophy based on dedication to quality and on the wish to safeguard and promote our terroirs. So basically, AdVini took the sustainable development term in 2008. So it was a long time ago. Mm-hmm. It's been more than 12 years since my department was created. So it was,
that's impressive.
We were pioneers. And we are here to help our colleagues to face all the big challenges of the wine industry. And there is a lot, you know that. I mean, like climate change, erosion of biodiversity, all the changes in social expectation. There is a lot of work to do. And the wine grower will have to adapt and to question their practices in front of all these changes. So for us at AdVini, the best way to do that is to think about the issue in the globality and complexity. That means to adopt an holistic approach, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So we no longer want to talk about fertilization or pesticide use, but rather about how the wine grower must observe and understand his or her, because there is a lot of women doing wine, you know, vineyard, and how it interacts with all the ecosystems. From this point of view, the wine growers' levels of action consist rather in preserving and developing the fertility of the system, for example, or acting on habitats to promote biodiversity.
Can you give us some examples of what you've done to preserve your ecosystems and promote biodiversity?
Yeah, of course. Since the campaign 2021, 100% of our vineyard is committed, at least on one level, organic, biodynamic, HEV, bee-friendly, the one that you have mentioned. And very often our estates are involved in several of these approaches. And I'm quite proud of that because everyone's joined the adventure. Mm-hmm. But the label approach is not enough for me. That means there is no perfect label yet, one that would identify all the holistic approach. So we are trying to go further by relying on biodiversity and the complex interaction between all the ecosystem. And to give you an example, we have launched a permaculture project this year. In an area which that kind of project is not necessarily expected. It's in the Château Capéguier. It's in Saint-Émilion appellation in the Bordeaux region. And our idea was very simple through the complementarity between the vines, the bushes, the ages, the cover crop. By changing our methods of implantation, of management, we were going to try to demonstrate that we can do viticulture in a different way. Mm-hmm. So the wine have been planted last month, and the last planting of aromatic plants will be next week. So the plot is already beautiful. So don't hesitate if you come in France to just come and see. So I think it's our more significant project linked with biodiversity issue. That's just to demonstrate that we can do it in another way.
How will you be able to measure the effects of this project of the increased biodiversity in the soil?
Well, actually, we have two main topics with that. We don't do it on our own because we don't know, but we are working with an entomological monitoring. That means that there is experts who will go in the parcel and count all the insects to see if all these populations, all this biodiversity have increased the population of insects. But also with bats and birds, which is much more difficult to count. And the other way is to study the soil. We will make a lot of analysis about the soil classical parameters, but also with all the what we call nematofauna. That means all the biodiversity in the soil. And we will make some monitoring at different stages just to see how it will progress in the time.
I'm going to ask you a really basic question, and sometimes those are the hardest to answer, but I feel like today there's a lot of important terms and words around sustainability, and people don't dare admit that they don't necessarily fully understand them anymore. Biodiversity, why is that so important for a vineyard and for a vineyard ecosystem?
There is two main kinds of biodiversity. The one in which we think at the beginning is the natural biodiversity. That means all the what we call auxiliary, which can all help the winemaker to make his job. That means there is a lot of birds, bats. You know that there is some kind of bats in the south of France, which is able to eat in one night more than 1,000 butterfly, which are making some. The larvae of these butterflies are eating the grapes. That's called edemis. So it's a main problem for us. And with a presence of a lot of bats, for example, it's possible to not use insecticides. They make the same thing. That's one of the main interests of biodiversity. The second one is that it's in the soil. Because all the fertility of the wine starts from the soil and the organic matter of the soil. And this organic matter just is produced by all the biodiversity of the soil, from the earthworm to the fungus, and all the bacteria are the only one able to eat the organic matter and make nutrients available for the plants. So it's really necessary for the vine growing. And the last kind of biodiversity that we don't always know is the cultivated biodiversity. I mean, as we are facing a lot of changes, we are starting to look about the different kind of variety of grapes. Some of them are more able to afford climate change, for example. Some of them are more able to fight against diseases, so they don't need pesticide use. There is a lot of things when you are looking for this kind of biodiversity, the cultivated one, which is really interesting also to think again our production systems.
Absolutely. We are talking a lot about the environmental aspect of sustainability, but I imagine your job covers all three pillars of sustainability. So what are some of the social and economic platforms that you've been working on?
Yeah, of course. My three main topics are how we can redesign our vineyard, how to include trees, cover crop, act on scale of landscape, all that kind of stuff. But also how you rethink the vision of the soil. I've spoken a lot about that, and how to protect vineyard. But I think the more crucial points, it's the human dimension, and you're totally right about that. It's impossible to initiate a transition if we do not take everyone with you.
Yes.
The women and men who run the vineyard must be rooted in their terroir and pragmatic, but they must also be in movement. Like that, we can change with the world which is changing around us. And so it's really, really important to involve everybody in this transition.
Absolutely. And so you were talking about, so you're mentioning some of the significant things your team has put in place, but moving forward, what are some of the major projects that you're working on?
There is a lot of them.
Makes your job interesting.
Yeah. But I think the biggest next challenge is going to be how we deal with climate change. Of course, Michelle will talk a lot about that, and much better than me, I guess. We talk a lot about how vineyards are going to have to adapt to climate change. But the other issue is how we can mitigate climate change. That's why we have launched a partnership with the World of Research by partnering with Supagro Montpellier, which is an agronomy school and research center dedicated to vine and wine in the south of France. And we seek to activate all the climate change mitigation levels that we have. That means vitiforestry, carbon sequestration in soils, plant cover, etc. Because facing the climate change, I think it's, well, everyone must do their parts, and we are trying to do so. I think it will be the most important topic in the next year.
I think your project in Saint-Emilion will probably yield wonderful results in terms of carbon sequestration.
It's part of this reflection. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And that also makes a great segue to introduce Michelle here. We were saying, of course, that Michelle is an expert in climate change. Michelle, very early on in her wine career, became passionate about the subject before a lot of people really knew what climate change was all about. And before climate change, unfortunately, became more of a climate emergency. So, Michelle, you mentioned something really interesting in our pre-seminar call, that until very recently, sustainability guidelines in many countries and many regions didn't even include an aspect of measuring carbon footprint. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's when we're talking about mitigation, right? There's always two parts for climate change. There's adaptation and mitigation. And mitigation is a big part of it, especially in the wine industry. And I have to say that still today, not that many sustainable certification include the tracking of the CO2. And yeah, it is. And New Zealand is including it in their certification. They've made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050, the first country to do so. California is now including it. And Vigneron Engagé, which we didn't talk about in France, it used to be Vigneron en Développement Durable. And it's interesting because they changed the marketing, the name, to Vigneron Engagé, and it's getting a lot more track now because that word is actually a more proactive word.
Yes.
And so it's getting more popularity with the consumer. It's really interesting. So now they are looking at the carbon footprint, and I've been thinking about this theme of what's old and new. And I think France, you were talking about the scandal of the pesticide and herbicide, which we all know about. But the thing is, France has so much to offer to the rest of the world, because for a very long time, being organic and biodynamic was also part of it. A lot of the pioneer are from France, and that's what inspired a lot of other producers in the world to do that. And when you actually, do a better soil management, and which usually you do when you have organic or, biodynamic practices or sustainable practices, then naturally your soil will sequestrate more carbon, more CO2. And they don't know yet how much CO2 exactly. It's complicated to measure that, and there's a lot of research being done in that regard. For example, in Australia, when you're they know that it's a bit more difficult to sequestrate the carbon because the soil are a lot more poor, because they're very, very old, right? So, but all of those techniques are actually really helping to capture the carbon. The other thing is France, when we're looking again at, being a leader, is that one of the things that really bothers me is that we don't really talk about so much about the CO2 that's produced during fermentation. And that is a very, very high concentration of CO2. And most certification, when they look at the CO2 emissions, They don't even take that into consideration, which is crazy because, just to give you an example, 1/8 of a ton of CO2 is produced per ton of grape.
Okay.
So at the end, it contributes to 80 to 90 grams of CO2 per bottle of wine. So that's huge. So the wine industry emits a lot of CO2.
Yeah.
So again, France, was one of the first countries to have producers to install a system to capture the CO2 and use carbon hydroxide to transform it back to calcium carbonate.
Yeah, Smith Haute Lafitte has those captors. Yeah. They were one of the first in Bordeaux, I think, and they sold it to pharmacies that were making toothpaste from it, I think.
Exactly. But if you talk there's major scientists in the world who are saying the wine industry can make a change, but we need to do this because one of the biggest part of the CO2 emissions we have, it's actually from there. Mm-hmm. So again, I think if we go back to the vineyard and the history of France moving forward, this is another example of something that France is one of the leaders in the world, because not many people do that. The other thing is cork. There was a period where we were saying, it's so cool to use a twist cap, because we don't have as much TCA problem. A lot of people are actually going back to cork because it's actually a sustainable product. Because when you look, the CO2 itself, the cork itself, can capture up to 592 grams per cork. So a stopper, yeah. So it varies, right? So the biggest is obviously the sparkling bottle because the corks are bigger. But every tons of cork for 1 ton of cork produced, you sequestrate 73 tons of CO2.
Any diploma or MW or sommelier students are listening? These are gold, these facts. Absolutely.
So, there's a lot, right? But I could go on. We were talking, Carmen was talking about the grapes that are being developed to, the cépage résistant.
Yeah.
Those grapes that are getting developed in the in the center, like at Montpellier, all the research center. It's not just the French that are actually looking at them to perhaps for solution of the growing fungal diseases. I was talking to 2 producers last week in Spain, in the Panellists region, and they were saying that last year, both of them, and those are organic producers, and they did everything they could, but they both lost 50% of the production to fungal disease.
Yeah.
So I asked them, I said, what are you...
These are in very dry regions generally.
Yes, exactly. So I said, what are you hoping to do? And they said, to be honest, we're starting to experiment with some of the French grapes that were being developed that are, because we cannot afford to lose that much every year.
No,
so I have, there's a lot to share, and I know you probably have questions for the other panelists, but these are all sorts of things that I think, again, France has a lot to offer in terms of going forward and adapting and mitigating climate change.
I think it's hugely important that you highlight all of this. And just a reminder to our participants, don't be shy. Throw any questions you have in the Q&A. We will address them at the end. But yeah, I think it's this theme, the idea of where we act like we're inventing something new with a lot of the practices that are being put in place, but a lot of it is just return, as I said, to pre-industrial times, the way we were farming naturally. And there is so much wisdom to be gained, and so many pioneers in France, and even modern recent pioneers that are really making huge changes. And it's this awareness, I think, that Carmen, you and Ellen are bringing to the conversation for people, really bringing it home, that is going to move the conversation forward. I think we're going to come back to you because I'm sure that there's lots of questions for you, and also just to get the conversation mixing up a little bit more. But I love to jump over to Ellen now, because we've talked a lot about the vineyards and about the winery and aspect of it. And I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more. So Ellen, as I mentioned, works with Genuine Wines, really a portfolio of natural, organic, sustainable wines. And it's really interesting to hear from the exporter side of things, and from the consumer side of things, a little bit more about sustainability practices. So Ellen, can you tell us a little bit more about Genuine Wines and where this commitment to sustainable wines sort of came from and how it's evolved?
Absolutely. My boss, my collaborator, Fanny, she started the company in 2008. And so it was at a time when concepts of natural wine and organic wine weren't as popular as they are now. And she was really very strong for this push for promoting these wines. And her concept was to create a company that had a portfolio of these wine regions that weren't necessarily the A regions that we all know, but more kind of the hidden areas, the B side. Mm-hmm. And when she would travel to a market, she would come with this group of producers. So it would kind of be a way to have one visit, but, hit a few birds with one stone. Mm-hmm. So you take the plane, but she would be able to show wines of Provence or wines of Jura or wines of the Loire, wines of the vineyard producers in Italy. And it was a great concept and it still works quite well. But now we've adapted to a virtual format.
Yes, as we all have.
And it's become even more sustainable than we could have ever imagined before. The concept of our tastings now are one-on-one, and wine fairs have become virtual. So we do a lot of investment in wine fairs to meet importers, of course, in markets that would have cost us a lot of carbon impact for traveling to Asia or traveling to South America or to Brazil or to Australia or to New Zealand. And now we do it comfortably in our own home with a one-on-one format directly with our winery producers. They've all become digital now, and it's become such a revolution for them.
It actually gives a more intimate experience, actually, for a lot of producers and a lot of buyers, because anybody who's been to a major wine trade fair knows that you've got 15 minutes, it's hectic. The wines are often served at an overly warm or cold temperature. They're not always the best, they're efficient in that you're meeting a lot of people in one place, but it's not always conducive to doing
I couldn't agree more, Jacky.
Quality business.
I couldn't agree more. And what's even more depressing is when you are hosting the salon, like your own stand at the fair, and you have to be there to witness the teardown on the last day. And
yes, I've
all the bottles being thrown out.
Yeah,
all of the cardboard, all of the carpets, everything that was just installed for a 3-day fair.
Yeah.
So the concept of that waste now not happening and just a direct shipment of the samples. We have a one-on-one meeting with the team and the buyers. And it's such an intimate experience when their offices and their living room almost,
Exactly.
So it's been a really great experience for us.
And how do you find that the consumers have evolved? Obviously, when we look at, there's been some really amazing wine intelligence data that's come out recently that Michelle shared with me about how, these are concepts for a lot of people. Organic wine, sustainable wine wasn't something that really registered. A lot of consumers just assumed wine as an agricultural product was natural, was organic, and or didn't really care or was willing to buy it if it didn't cost more. But there really wasn't a big uptake. But Wine Intelligence, they did major market research last year across several key wine export markets and showed that there was actually quite high interest in purchasing sustainably produced wine, especially going forward, and a favorable perception of sustainable certification programs, certification logos, and a willingness to pay more, especially from millennials and the Gen Zs. And so have you found that your consumers have evolved, that there's more understanding, there's more interest, there's more sort of involvement with the category of wines?
Certainly. And both within the category of vineyard producers we work with, more for the on-trade markets, but also nothing is more clear that demands this, which is the monopolies. And we work very seriously with the monopolies in Sweden and Norway, of course, in the SAQ, the SAC, LCBO, and throughout Canada. And their tenders demand more and more and more organics, if almost, I think, to a point. Same thing if you don't even have a score or a critique coming from a respected magazine. But now, if you have some kind of certification, then the favorability towards the buyers looking at your products is so much more increased than it ever had been before. Before, it was kind of like producers.
It was a nice plus that didn't.
Yeah, it was a plus. And even in the past, it was something like, oh, hippie, you're going to write organic on your label. Like you want to be classified in that category. And now it's like, you must have something like, what are you doing? Tell me about your soil. How do you work? It's crazy. It's been a really nice, pleasant change for the producers we work with, and something that's developed, I see throughout France more and more.
Absolutely. And retailers can really drive these things forward. The LCBO was one of the first to insist on lighter weight bottles. I remember I was working for a winery in southern France. And obviously in the south of France, you have the engravings on all of the different appellation wines. And when they said that all of the wines in their generalist category under $20, I think it was, had to be under 420 grams at the time, this was just, how are we going to make this happen? This is shocking. And now it's just become the norm. And, it's absolutely driving change, which is so important. So you mentioned things that your company is doing, and obviously the virtual aspect is huge. And you said you're doing more stuff locally as well. And when you're visiting your local clients, you can do everything on your bike. And there's the aspect of really bringing it into you're obviously working internationally, but you're bringing it back locally as well. So it's sort of a full circle aspect.
Yeah, e-commerce in France has increased so much, thankfully, this past year. Thanks to COVID, despite COVID, and that's been a bonus. Online sales, of course. And when we do market visits, especially in regions where you can take out a bike for the day and you cycle around and you take the samples to a few bars and you taste with the buyers, or you take a little scooter or an electric bike. There's so many options now to do things when you arrive in the market sustainably. Taking the local subway system, taking the train. We love to travel by train in France. We're blessed to have such a great
so easy
network
and so
here.
fast.
Exactly.
I just took the train from Montreal to Toronto. It's not the same experience.
Yeah, we're not there yet. So it's been a really great way to have that connection of more ecological impact when you're visiting the markets. Even to connect with our importers. Everyone likes to send a Christmas card or a holiday card.
Yes. And
how did we have to change this year? Well, we did an online cookbook, and we invited all of our producers to send us their favorite recipe of home. Everyone's at home cooking anyhow now with their wine pairing. And then we made it something virtual online that not only was a nice greeting for our importers, but they could then share with their best clients as well. So it's kind of a nice way to connect with people. Yeah.
I love what you said about how sustainability, this last year with the pandemic and COVID in general has, obviously pushed us online, and e-commerce is growing and virtual platforms are growing. And now everybody knows how to use Zoom, which we didn't know how to do 18 months ago. But there really definitely has been a huge move forward, I think, in terms of people's commitment towards sustainability and innovation, I think, in sustainability during this period. And I was wondering if Carmen or Michelle, either of you had some interesting examples or some thoughts on how the pandemic has actually driven, if we're looking for silver linings, how this has driven us forward in terms of sustainability. Anybody want to dive in?
I do. I think that we've all seen pictures of cities we know, especially early on in the pandemic, they were showing pictures of the air that was much clearer in big cities, whether it was in India or in Venice. But I think most scientists say that this is just a little look, a little insight of what this can become. And I think as much I'm so excited to see the change that we all taken because we were forced to. I truly hope that we keep that afterwards. I was talking to some friends of mine in Australia a few days ago, and they only have 20 cases in the country. So they're full on. They're back on to normal life. And he was saying, I've never been so busy in my life. Like my social calendar is full. And so I think that in periods like this, often, whether it was the war or now the pandemic, we've learned some things, but it's easy to go back to because we're just so excited. And so, yeah, so exactly. So I think scientists are saying we are having a chance right now to see what it could be. Yes. And so let's make sure that when this is all over, yes, we are excited to share times together, but perhaps we can keep some of those sustainable practices, whether it's to travel less and do more Zoom, or, maybe if we do travel, we maximize our time in that region to do multiple visits. So I personally hope that this is, we will keep on this going on this track to be more sustainable.
Absolutely. And the hope is that there'll be a sort of a hybrid that comes into place where obviously you can never fully eradicate travel. I mean, especially when you're initiating relationships. But the hope is then to minimize and sort of have a hybrid system where, you can, there's many, Ellen was talking about these great tastings they're doing. They're so intimate because they're one-on-one. You have a mix between the Zoom conversation.
Absolutely.
Carmen, are there things that this past year, because of the pandemic, have sort of changed the way you guys have been working?
Yeah. In France, we have seen a lot of, well, it's not in the way of we are working, but a lot of consciousness about what is produced around you. And there is a lot of, it works for vegetables, but also with wine, a lot of people that just taking conscience about, okay, maybe my just neighbor is producing something that I still don't know, and how I'm not able to move more than 10 kilometers, for example, I will just take time to taste it. And it was a really good phenomenon just to, okay, I would like to discover what I have around me and what I see from my window every day.
The local.
Yeah. And this local movement was really interesting. It was also a sustainability movement because the consumption of all the organic products have increased also. Well, it's not the replacement of the international exchange, because I really like to taste wine from abroad, and that's necessary for me. But this tendency of just looking around also, I think it's very interesting. And I guess when this link is created, it stays. I hope so, at least.
I have some great questions coming in, and there's one that I'm going to jump on right now because I thought it was quite interesting. But from Jenny was asking, what does the future of sustainability look like in the wine industry? And she adds that I feel like the specific effects of climate change on viticulture and viniculture are often overlooked in the discourse. I found the fact about fungal disease so interesting. Are there other areas where sustainably focused producers will need to direct their attention? Who would like to? Carmen, do you want to jump in? You want me to rephrase? Or?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there will be a lot of changes. That's obvious, because we don't, as you say, Jacky, we can't stay producing in the old way. I know, the industrial way. It will not be affordable anymore. With all
That's a good point, actually. Sorry to cut you off, but people forget about the fact that it's not only not sustainable for the planet, it's also not affordable. You actually, in the long term, can have savings by going back to more natural methods. But carry on.
Of course, no. Be my guest. We already have this kind of problem in some traditional way cultivating vines. That means all the question about organic matter. Organic matter, you have to see it as a capital. And when you just eat it piece by piece, it disappears. And at the end, your vine died. So we are in front of something and we have to change. And I think that's consideration of a soil like living thing. It's not just a support for your vine. It's also a complex ecosystem that need to be cared, to be feed, to be all that. I think this point of view will increase and will be a solution also to mitigate the climate change issue. I think the vegetal material, also the kind of new variety, will be a very cover crop, but also hybrid variety.
Planting
all the plantings. I think there will be a big field of experimentation also. And I've talked about permaculture, which is, I think, a very interesting way to complexify your ecosystems, to diversify your ecosystems, and to find more resiliency. We didn't talk about that, but it's, I think, a main topics about the agricultural production. We need to find that kind of complementarity. And a point that I didn't mention, I think it's interesting also, is that there is the false idea that the vine must suffer to produce a quality wine.
That's an old adage.
Okay, that's false. That's completely counterproductive. but for us, the essential is to fight against all the deficiencies on the vine, and that requires, as I said, good nutrition from the soil, but also when it's necessary, irrigation. I think it's sometimes not well perceived, but water, when it's brought in reasonable quantity and perfectly at the right time, can be a great ally to obtain a perfect quality wine. And we will need to use innovating process. We are developing a really interesting project that's also, I'm so proud of this too, about artificial intelligence to evaluate the level of hydric stress in our vineyards and to be able to just bring the exact and the correct quantity of wine at the good moments.
So they're like water probes, or but a sort of a next generation, or?
No, it's it's a system that's, to evaluate in the very precise way the hydric stress of a plant. You are supposed to make some measurements in the middle of the night, so it's not easy to make. And we have done that for 3 years, so we have a lot of data, and like that, we have trained artificial intelligence to be able to modelize, link with all the characteristic of the plots, link with weather data, and crossing all that, we are able to predict the level of stress and to take the good decision to decide to give water or not. Yeah, and it's made us able to not waste water, because water is a main issue facing climate change. So yeah, all that are I think very exciting topics, and they will be useful for the next years.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to jump in on wine?
Yeah, to your point, Carmen, also with using alternatives for sure with monitoring water, but also reducing even sulfur and copper usage, and alternative products that are being used, such as orange peel oil, aloe vera treatments. We have a producer that uses the whey from cheese production to spray. And also using a kind of clay spray on the leaves to protect against really
sunburn.
Exactly, like a sunscreen. And these are things that old farmers would have around and they would use. And it's such a great product, and you just have to look at what's already being produced by Mother Nature.
Exactly.
Another thing to touch on is the use of animals in vineyards that I've never seen to such a level, let alone sheep that kind of follow the vines throughout the winter period to eat all the herbs that are growing, cows, using pigs at producers in Sancerre, and of course using horses to till soil versus tractors for compaction. It's just becoming this really lovely bucolic life that's existing now, and it's something that's a delight to see.
Absolutely. Michelle, you seem to add something.
I just wanted to talk about water, because for me, that's the main thing about climate change. One of the main things to me is the CO2 and the water. And, when we look at South Africa, when we look at the prediction of what's going to happen in terms of the rising temperature, what we do know, and there's lots of different scientists who have different projections, but pretty much everyone is agreed that in those already dry and hot region, that drought is only going to increase, and a lot of population will have to migrate, to leave where they live, because it's not going to be viable to have agriculture to feed them. And so when we looked in 2018 in South Africa, when there were a restriction on water, because there was the first time in history that a major city like Cape Town went down below 11% in the water level in the city. So what they did is they told all people doing agriculture to not irrigate. So that's not just grapes, but that's everyone. And so if you look at it and you look at what's going to happen, grapes are not going to be the crop that we're trying to save the most. It's going to be, we're going to want to feed people, because the population is going to increase a lot from now until 2050. So I think, like Carmen was saying, companies that are doing research on how to maximize the rainwater during the winter, and so that throughout the drier times we have access to water. To me, it is definitely one of the biggest thing that we have to do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We have so many questions going. I think we could just stick on this question for the rest of the seminar, but I think we might frustrate our participants today. So I'm just going to, Séverine from Le Vieux Pain has asked a few awesome questions. This one actually is for you, Michelle, and since you're up on the screen, I'm going to keep you. Regarding carbon sequestration, could you expand on the metrics used to quantify how much carbon has been captured in the soil?
That's a great question, Séverine. Thanks for listening and being with us. That's what I was saying is I read a lot of research and it's quite complicated. I was reading a research recently done just in Australia, and what they were saying is it is difficult right now to exactly measure how much. Yeah, and so I don't have this answer, Séverine, yet because researchers don't yet. I think they're trying to find that, and it's not easy. So they're working on that.
Séverine had another question. This one is for Carmen. What kind of incentive do you present to your growers to get them more involved in your sustainability actions?
Well, actually, there is a lot of way to convince people. It depends on people. And what is really interesting is that the common interest is every time more involving people. You don't have to, well, it's an argument in this form, and I think it's really interesting. The other thing is that when we are working with the more complex ecosystems, you at the end of the day you have less work and you have less charges. Mm-hmm. And that's two really important topics. Just an example, we are working still in Bordeaux, but in another vineyard. We are working with the trail of permanent cover crop behind the row with a mix of different kind of nitrogen fixator plants, mm-hmm. But very small ones that can stay all the year. Okay. And that means that you don't have to use any, well, we don't use herbicide anymore, but we don't have to use fuel to take them back. So it's at the end of the year, it's less time, it's less carbon emission, mm-hmm. and it's less charges. So mm-hmm. that's our argument, and we are now, at the difference of the carbon sequestration in soil, now we have some data for all that kind of economics that we can do when you are just applying these practices. And the last obvious level of action is the fact that when you are in the labeled process, I don't know, organic, for example, your wine are just sell at a higher price, right? Because people are just
so you're buying from your grower partners. You'd be buying in at a higher price if they're
exactly. So yeah, there is different level, different arguments, different incentive, depending of people we are talking to. But yeah, mainly the street type works in each case, more or less.
And the training, as you mentioned, getting people excited and getting people involved in what they're doing can, beyond financial incentive, can sometimes be much more powerful for people when they feel engaged in something so important, and they see the results in their vineyards of the quality of their grapes.
We are trying to start a lot of training with all the people, at all the level of decision in the company, and we do one month ago about water management, for example, and it was really, really interesting we start with really theoretical stuff, just saying, okay, how a wine use water, when it's needed, when it's not, how it works. And at the end of the day, everybody was really, really happy about that, like just understanding better what they are doing in the vineyard, yes. And yes. Make them able to think and to have this global and holistic approach. It was really interesting.
That's absolutely it. I mean, all of these projects, they cannot survive if the people who are implicated are not, feeling involved, feeling like they're part of something, and feeling that they're being consulted, feeling that they're being considered throughout the process. So it's hugely important. We have another question here from Arnica, who asks, are there any certifications that mandate intentional carbon farming or activities that sequester more carbon? Not optional, but mandatory. The only one I know of is the regenerative certification. So are there any certifications that make it mandatory? that oblige you?
So I'm not sure if I understand correctly the question, but I know that, if you look at the California Sustainability Program, you do need to reduce your carbon footprint. Same thing.
They don't specify specific activities that would sequester, that would capture more carbon within.
I think that there's still
guidelines.
research. I think that everyone knows that soil management, for example, encourages more carbon sequestration, but it's hard to oblige something if you don't know yet how much you're capturing. So I think there's a lot of research.
I don't think Arnica was specifically talking about soil necessarily, just within the guidelines that there be a notion that you've got to find ways to capture carbon.
No, and that's the problem. So we hope that is going to change.
Well, that's a good question, making us think about it and move forward. I have all kinds of other questions. Let me just scroll here for a second. I had a great one.
Maybe I can add meanwhile.
Oh yeah, jump in.
There is some reflection in France linked with the label bas carbone, which is not actually working on agriculture for the moment. Well, it's just a lot of reflection for the moment, but the idea is exactly that. Following your emission trajectory and trying to help you to decrease, but it's really difficult to quantify when you're speaking about, for example, soil sequestration. So yeah, that's reflection are just starting, and I think it will be really interesting to get involved in that.
Absolutely. Definitely something to follow for the future. We have a question here. The participant asked, I would like to learn more about how the supply chain factors into a wine's sustainability. Can the panelists share more about this? Also, where can I learn more? So I'm not quite sure who was speaking at that time. I feel like this might be more of an Ellen question. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but how does the supply chain factor into wine sustainability? I think we talk a lot about viticulture and the winery, and potentially talking more now about, shipping and retail and that end stage, getting to the consumer's home and table.
Yeah, certainly. So the wines, they're packaged on a pallet when they leave, and the packaging is obviously step number one when it leaves the winery. Like we spoke about glasses. Of course, glass is such a huge component of the imprint, but then we have to look at alternatives like bag and box. It has become such a great packaging tool and demanded more and more in monopoly countries, because we're putting more premium wines in these type of bag and box containers, and they're being designed to look quite chic. Then of course we have the bigger orders. If they go on the boat, then it's going to be a much less impact for the bigger export versus them being on a refrigerated plane.
Of course.
And we know how much that can cost, but some people are inclined to put their wines on a refrigerated plane because they're unsure of the quality when it arrives. The easier answer to that is just buying local and buying wines that are produced locally, of course.
Then we wouldn't be able to drink your beautiful.
I know. I really want you all to, but boat seems to be the best option for when it arrives into the market. And we want the glass bottles, of course, to be lower weight, 420 grams, like you said. For the monopolies, is kind of a really basic standard for them.
And sorry to carry on.
No, continue on.
No, I was just thinking of something that came up in our pre-seminar call. We were talking about the importance of trying to drink local, to eat local, to consume within your regions. And obviously we don't all have beautiful wines produced in our regions. And Michelle brought up a really interesting point about how trucking, when you think is local and it's actually, 1,000 kilometers away, trucking that distance can sometimes have a higher carbon footprint than shipping. Could you give us a little bit of more info on that, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add on to the supplier chain, when you track your carbon emission as a company, there's different scope, right? And scope 3 actually looks at all of your suppliers. So as a company, you actually have incentive to encourage your supplier to change. And maybe, the boxes you're using, for example, are not using chlor, or you're using, so there's a lot of things in scope 3, that looks at the supply chain. So it is actually part of your mandate. If you wish to reduce your CO2, you need to look at scope 3. But going back to transportation, and you can go, if you go to Hillebrand, for example, website, you'll find lots of information. And also when I did the conference in Montreal at Tasting Climate Change, you can watch the video just on transportation. And it's very interesting because they talked about, for example, if you're within France and you're sending the wine from one place to another, well, it's good to maximize so that you're using more like rivers or streams, and electric trucks, obviously, if you can. But yeah, if you're sending a wine, very far away, like 7-hour drive versus shipping it in bulk on a boat, you're better off to do it on a boat. And there's measure you can calculate. If you go on Hillebrand, you can play with it and see where you're leaving and where you're arriving. And companies like that, what they try to do and help you when you're shipping wine is to look, they will advise you on the best logistics possible to ship wine. So for example, in New Zealand, a lot of producers, when they ship wine, even though it's within the same country, they don't ship by the road. They ship using the ocean.
Waterways.
Exactly, because it's less of a carbon footprint.
So that was great. Our part of the question was, where can I find resources? So Hillebrand's website, Tasting Climate Change, has a ton of great resources. So these are definitely things that can help us further this conversation. Because Michelle, I think you have a statistic on the percentage that shipping and packaging plays in the overall carbon footprint of a bottle of wine.
So it varies. And it varies, right? So, and depending who you read, but combined, they can be up to 78%, both of them together. And then it depends where it leaves, and the packaging can be up to 40%.
It's huge. I mean, we spend so much time talking about what we can do to improve in the vineyards, to improve in the winery. But how many times have I had a winery give me a beautiful story about all they're doing in their vineyards and then hand me these great, big, heavy, massive bottles. And I think that's something that we have to get out of. Is it from consumers or is it wineries that believe that you cannot be premium unless you have this hulking bottle and this, big etched label? That's definitely gonna be something that's got to change in the mindset. And it definitely will. If you look at, 10, 15 years ago, screw cap bottles, potentially here we were more comfortable with them in New Zealand, Australia, but in France, I was living in France at the time, a screw cap was a cheap wine. Nobody would ever bring a screw cap bottle of wine to their friend's house for supper. So those mindsets are changing. It was great what Ellen mentioned about these bag-in-boxes. Again, a format that was considered so cheap and, just for a summer poolside party. And now they're making quite chic packaging and people are really...
And also within wines. Domestic France, having more and more consumption of these bag-in-box organic wines, bag-in-box vin nature. You can find it, and it's part of the demand for the consumer. And it's something that we're happy to support.
Absolutely. I have to just move
just
a little.
Last
Go ahead, Carmen.
Point about all these things about eco-design. I think it's really, really interesting, and it's necessary to action all the levels that you have when you're a producer. And this is really difficult to make people move about what they found. It's a quality packaging. Above all in France, as you say, I totally share what you say about French people and with the bag-in-box tradition. We have started that kind of eco-design policy in AdVini since 2 years. And just making some sensibilization with the marketing teams and that kind of things. We have just decreased a little bit the average weight of our bottle, but at the end of a year, it was like more than 900 tons of glass, which wasn't wasted, and it's more than 1,000 tons of CO2 emission, which are not produced just because we have made this little change, taking a bottle just a little bit less heavy. So all that kind of small changes are really, really important.
Yeah, and the more of those small changes that every producer made that small change, the impact would be massive.
Yeah, and it's really coherent with all the other step of the production,
Absolutely.
And I think we have a big part. Sorry, Jacky. I think
Oh, please.
you know, in the wine trade, I think we have a big part in communicating that to consumer,
Yes.
because it's overwhelming for consumer. Imagine if tomorrow you decide to learn about music or literature, and you go to library with all of those books and you don't know where to start. It's difficult. So I think it's we have the sommeliers, the importers, the trade, the writers. I think it's our job to communicate that, so we find an easier way to tell that to consumer, that it's okay to buy in a bag in the box, and it's okay if the bottle is lighter, and so on.
We have a comment that just came in that said it's worth mentioning that some producers were doing bulk bag-in-box for wine bars in France over a decade ago. Great for the bar and great for the planet. Absolutely. Absolutely. But the bars were keeping these bag-in-boxes hidden behind the counter, because while the wine tasted the same come out of the bag-in-box or coming out of the bottle, if the consumer saw the bag-in-box, they would have been horrified. So that mindset for the consumer is what really needs to change. And that obviously has to be driven by the winery. I think at the winery level, at the retailer level, you're so afraid to shock the consumer, but you also have a role to lead the consumer towards new things. And especially, I mean, we live in for those of you based in Canada, these are monopoly markets. There's not a huge choice when it comes to where you're going to go and buy your alcohol. So the retailer really can easily lead in terms of innovation and sustainability. So that's why it's so great to see at the SEQ, the LCBO, System Bolliget, a lot of these monopoly systems where they're really imposing these stringent sustainability measures. Some have worked better than others. I don't think Tetra Pak was ever a big success for the LCBO, but they did try to get behind that. And that's, there's a lot of trial and error, obviously, when it comes to these sustainability measures. Was there any topics that we came up with? I encourage my panelists to ask any more questions you have going. But I was actually wondering, as we're talking, there's so many great things that came up that we glossed over, but then had a new question come in or had a new panelist come in. Were there other parts of the conversation that you were eager to dive into? You think, oh, I really wish we could have covered that. Carmen, projects that you're working on that are really cool that you didn't get to mention, or Ellen, things that you're doing at Genuine, or Michelle. Michelle is a font of information, not only from Tasting Climate Change, but Michelle is an MW candidate, a couple months away from her exams. So she is full of great information, and especially on this topic being so dear to her heart.
I can jump in if you like, Jacky. Just
Please.
Something fun that we're attempting is working with a company that's based in Brittany, in Bretagne, in France, called Grain de Sel.
Oh, yes,
wine.
we were talking about. Yes, tell us,
so
please.
Their project's so great. So what they do is they'll load up their sailboat, and they'll load it up with wines to drop off into New York. And then they'll continue with the sailboat down to Central and South America to pick up chocolate and coffee that they'll load back on the sailboat and then come back to France and do this full circle. Yeah. So we're hoping to have our wines join their second voyage coming up in the next few months. But it's such a fun project. I don't know if it's going to be on a large scale ever in the future, but it's nice that people are thinking about alternative modes of transportation.
And I think that's great also because we're talking about raising awareness for consumers and how sustainability can be a complicated topic for consumers. You're vaguely aware that this is, what you should be doing and how you should be purchasing. But in practice, what does it mean? And to see the sailboat come into the port and have it explained to people that it's then going to pick up other cargo, it's never going to be making an empty journey. I think that's a great visual, impactful way to show people.
Yeah, super old school, like 1800s old school transportation.
When's this next voyage going to take place?
I believe it's set for the next few months. We have it. I think my colleague in particular, she went to the maiden voyage launch and she was out there celebrating and waving goodbye up in Bretagne. So yeah, it's such a fun atmosphere for everyone. They're all really exciid. And I think you can follow them on Instagram, their voyage.
So what's the Instagram tag?
It's called Grain de Sel Wines, GRAIN.
Okay.
DESAIL.
All right. Well, everybody check that
out.
out.
I'll have everyone. I'll send the link.
Awesome. That sounds great. Michelle, you looked like you had something that you were keen to
Oh no, I was just excited about what Carmen was saying because I read about this company and I was quite taken. But I think just going back to what you're saying, Jacky, and all of us, I think we're talking a lot about viticulture and so on. But I think at the end of the day, the consumer, he's the one who makes the purchase. And going back to research done by the Wine Intelligence, I'm quite obsessed with this company because they do so much great research.
Amazing, yeah.
It's amazing. And one of the things they were saying, they were talking about the way the brain works when you're doing a purchase, something as simple as a bottle of wine. Okay. And what they're saying is the brain has, like they call it system 1 and system 2.
Like
and
the different hemispheres sort of thing?
Yeah, and basically they're referring to system 1 with the very simple everyday decisions. Okay. And system 2 is more the part of your brain that goes for real decisions. So, like your work, your job, your family. And so when you're in front, of a shelf, and if you have to read a text, for example, and it's too much work. You're in between picking up the kids, buying something. If you don't see a clear logo or sign that gives you indication that, this is a sustainable product, they're just going to choose something, and they might likely choose something they don't really want to choose. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of choice when you go to a store. And I think that's why those certifications you were mentioning early on, they're so helpful for consumer because it's a simple logo to look at. And you have to make the decision quickly. You're not going to read a text of 50. As much as we love writing, they're in a hurry. And so I think it's always good to remind ourselves that, because at the end of the day, it's the consumer who makes the decision.
Exactly. And that's, you got to make it simple for them. And I think it's interesting what you were saying earlier about just the change of name to viticulture engagée. Somehow the word engaged resonated more firmly with consumers and really brought them an uptick. Because as you said, when you're making your purchasing decisions while you're buying your groceries and your phone rings and your kids are waiting for you to pick up, you have a split second to pick that bottle of wine up. And as much as you're willing to make the right decision, it has to be easy for you. It has to be made simply. And that's, Carmen, are there any reflections happening at the moment as to how to communicate all of the great things you're doing better to your end consumer?
Totally. It's definitely a big issue for us. I totally agree with what Michelle says. All the label well-known are a way to communicate. But as I said, there is no perfect label, making that you have this holistic approach. So you can just make some big plots of different logo, but it's not really understandable for people neither. So, but we are actually, some of our vineyard have biodynamics, organic, HEV, bee friendly, vegan, and at the end, there is a lot of logo and it's not clear neither.
Yeah.
So we are trying to fix it out, how to communicate. And with all the topics about eco-design, for example, there is no logo for that kind of things. For the, as Hélène said, for the good way of transportation, for example, neither. So it's difficult to have one simple information. So what we are trying to do is to communicate a little bit more about all of our issue. We are starting to make some webinar, and Michelle was one of the guests of this webinar, so you can hear it again. To just start to make people, when they have time, the podcast format. Well, when you're driving, for example, or when you're walking, or I don't know, making things at home, just to, if it's not simple to have just one logo, okay, we will take time to explain to you what are the issue. And like that, you can just be a little bit more aware about all the complexity of the situation, and you are more able to make a good choice. So yeah, we are just, but there is no simple answer to that question. No. There is no simple way. So there is these two things. Just be involved with all the well-known label, just to be like they are trusted by people. So yeah, it's good to have them, but in the same way, we have to, as producer, we have to communicate about what we do, why we do that, and what are the issues to make people more able to understand this complexity. I think it's the two of these points are really complementary.
Hugely important. There's something that you mentioned earlier that I was keen to have you explain a little bit more. I'm going a little bit off topic, but it's something that I was chatting about with Gerald Bertrand the other day. Can you talk to people about bee friendly? I think that that's not something that you necessarily hear about outside of France, and I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, differently, it's a kind of a label which have been done by beekeeper at the beginning, and it was made to create a plot of practices which are good for bees. That means there is also obviously some things about pesticide use, but also about
pollinators,
cover crop, for example, cover crop which are useful for bees. You don't have to make any operation in the middle of the day because it's the time that bees are outside. There is a lot of consideration. You have to work with a beekeeper to have bees in your plots. You have to keep some part of the surfaces with a lot of flowers, what we call the jachère mellifère in French. I don't know the term.
Pollinators, yeah.
Okay. And all that kind of little things are made to create a good environment for bees. And if it's worked for bees, it works for a lot of other parts of biodiversity also, of course. And this kind of approach is really interesting because it's really easy, understandable for people as we talk about how to communicate. It's a very, very complex issue to have a lot of different actions to help pollinators to survive. But at the end of the day, you are protecting bees. So that is understandable for people. And
that's one of the reasons that I brought it up is that that's a very easy thing. People know that there is a crisis, that we are losing our bee populations, and a bee-friendly sticker on a bottle of wine is something that's very simple for a consumer to understand that this is a company that, you know, is doing something in an environmentally conscious way.
As the label is made by the beekeepers, it's really like complete and credible.
That's interesting.
And that's, at the end of the day, it's really important too.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I like this.
And is that something that's growing in France? When Gerald Bertrand was talking about that the other day, I have to admit that was the first time I'd heard of the certification. Is that something that's taking hold? Ellen's nodding. Do you have a lot of producers who are? We
have more and more producers that have bees. It's almost like, you know, you plant vines, you're going to have bees. It's second nature right now.
Yeah,
and it's something that is just, people are asking more and more for it. And it's also another way to have products that are, like you say, eating local, drinking local, that are produced by the estate.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's so, it's just such a rich topic. And I think that we've done a pretty good job. I mean, it's pretty vast. And I think that it's one of those things that you could go on and on for such a long time. But I feel like we've done a pretty good job of taking, first of all, the bottle of wine through its life cycle, because I do feel like there's a lot of conversations that revolve heavily around the vineyards and the winery. And it's so important. We're talking about supply chain. We're talking about importers, exporters, distributors, retailers, right to the end consumer. And to talk about all of this, you know, wading through all these different certifications. It wasn't very long ago that a lot of producers actually, you know, there was talk of people stepping away from being certified because, one, it was too complicated, or two, they felt that there was, you know, too much use of heavy toxins, or that people didn't understand and weren't buying it. So what was the point? And I feel like there's been a real sort of 180 done where people are coming back to that. And I think, Carmen, you said really well, the fact that it's a very easy way for the consumer. And I think, Michelle, you mentioned this as well. It's a very easy, succinct way for the consumer to see how engaged the winery is. And also from the winery perspective, I was talking to a winery the other day that said, as much as, yes, it's a headache to have all these audits, to fill out all this paperwork and all the rest, it forces you to never take shortcuts. It forces you to be accountable to yourself, to your vineyards, to your consumers. And that's obviously one of the big things. And apparently I've heard that the paperwork is slightly less of a headache and easier than it used to be. Carmen, you can tell me if that's true or not, but my experience with French paperwork was always quite disastrous. But I just wanted to thank you all so much for being with us today. Not only is this a really important conversation to be having across any platform, but having it with such experienced, highly intelligent, and diverse cross range of amazing women is so great. Sharing our voices and raising them and working towards these donations that are so important. And we've really, this is the last of our spring seminar series. They've gone incredibly well. And I'm really proud to say that we've raised a substantial amount of money that goes right into our scholarship. We're a not-for-profit, goes right into our scholarship fund to really help future generations of women or people who identify as women at all ages and all stages in their careers really come and apply for these scholarships to give them that boost they need to take it further. So there's more women leading in the wine industry. So thank you everybody so much. I think we're going to wrap it up there. And it was a delight to speak to all of you today. Thank you to AdVini. Thank you to everybody. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Jacky. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, AdVini, and thank you, FdV.
Thank you, everyone.